Picture this. You wake up before dawn, not to the gentle chime of an alarm clock or the soft glow of your phone screen, but to the crack of a whip and the barking of an overseer. Your bed isn't memory foam, it's a thin straw mattress crawling with insects. Your morning coffee, that's a luxury you'll never taste. Welcome to what might just be the worst job in human history. A position you never applied for, never wanted, and could never quit. The year is 1750. You're on a tobacco plantation in Colonial Virginia, and you're about to discover why being a plantation slave makes your worst Monday morning look like a spa day. So dim those lights, maybe turn on that fan for a gentle hum, and settle in as we explore the unforgiving reality of a life stolen, a humanity denied, and a daily existence that would break most of us before breakfast. Tonight, we're not just learning history, we're walking in shoes that were never meant to fit anyone, on paths paved with unimaginable suffering, the dawn of suffering. Your day begins at 4 a.m. The plantation bell clangs through the humid Virginia air like a death knell, shattering what little peace the night offered. You jolt awake, not from a peaceful slumber, but from the restless half-sleep that comes when your body is perpetually exhausted, but your mind refuses to fully surrender to rest. The wooden boards beneath your straw mattress creak as you shift, and immediately you feel the familiar ache in your back, a constant companion since you were old enough to work the fields. Your quarters, if we can dignify them with such a name, are nothing more than a single room shared with 8 other souls, each fighting their own daily battle for survival. The cabin measures roughly 12 by 16 feet, with a dirt floor that turns to mud when the rains come through the gaps in the wooden walls. There are no windows, just openings covered with crude wooden shutters that do little to keep out the elements. The smell hits you first, every morning, a mixture of unwashed bodies, stale air, and the lingering smoke from the small fire pit that serves as your only source of heat and light. You share this space with Big Martha, an older woman whose hands are gnarled from decades of picking tobacco leaves, her fingers permanently stained brown from the sticky resin. There's young Samuel, barely 14 but already bearing the weight of a man's workload, his eyes holding a wariness that no child should know. Mary sits in the corner, still nursing her latest baby while trying to tend to her 3-year-old, who coughs constantly from the damp air. The baby was fathered by the master's son, a fact everyone knows but no one dares speak aloud. Your clothes, if we can call them that, consist of a single shirt made from the coarsest homespun cloth, rough enough to chafe your skin with every movement. Your pants are patched and repatched, held together more by hope than thread. In winter, you might receive a thin blanket, but summer offers no such relief. Your feet are often bare, save for the crude shoes you're given once a year, shoes that typically fall apart within months from the constant wear and the harsh conditions of field. As you stumble to your feet, every joint protests. Your diet, consisting mainly of cornmeal, molasses, and the occasional scrap of salted pork, provides just enough calories to keep you alive and working, but nowhere near enough to maintain real health. You're perpetually malnourished, your body drawing on reserves it doesn't have, aging you far beyond your years. At 25, you feel 50. At 50, if you're lucky enough to survive that long, you feel ancient. The water you splash on your face comes from a communal barrel that's refilled weekly, assuming the weather cooperates. The water is often stagnant, sometimes green with algae, and always warm from sitting in the Virginia heat. You've learned not to think too hard about what else might be swimming in that barrel. Cleanliness is a luxury you can't afford, both in terms of time and resources. A full bath is a rare occurrence, perhaps monthly if you're fortunate, and always in the same water used by others before you, stepping into hell, the walk to the fields. As you step outside your quarters, the humid air hits you like a wet blanket, even at this early hour. The summer temperatures in colonial Virginia are unforgiving, often reaching the high 90s by midday with humidity that makes the air feel thick enough to chew. But even in the cooler months, the work never stops, and neither does the suffering. The plantation stretches out before you like a green ocean of tobacco plants, each row representing hours of back-breaking labor ahead. This particular plantation spans over 800 acres, though you'll never see most of it. Your world is confined to the specific section you've been assigned to work, day after day, week after week, year after year. The repetition is mind-numbing, designed to break your spirit as thoroughly as the work breaks your body. You join the silent procession of other enslaved workers making their way to the fields. There's no conversation, no morning pleasantries. Speaking during these early hours is discouraged, sometimes violently. The only sounds are the shuffle of bare feet on hard-packed earth, the occasional cough, and the ever-present buzz of insects that will torment you throughout the day. The overseer, a white man named Jeremiah Collins, stands at the edge of the field like a sentinel. He's a small man, barely 5'6", but the whip coiled at his belt and the pistol in his waistband make him a giant in this small world. Collins isn't the plantation owner. He's hired help, paid to extract maximum productivity from human chattel. He takes his job seriously, viewing each enslaved person not as a human being, but as a piece of farm equipment that needs constant supervision and occasional repair. Collins has been doing this for 12 years, and the work has hardened him in ways that would be difficult to understand for someone who has never held such power over other human beings. He genuinely believes that enslaved people are naturally lazy and require constant supervision and threat of punishment to work effectively. This belief system allows him to sleep at night, to look at himself in the mirror each morning, to attend church on Sundays and consider himself a good Christian man. The tobacco fields, where bodies and souls are broken. Your primary crop is tobacco, specifically Nicotiana tabacum, a plant that will literally change the course of American history and fuel the colonial economy for generations. But for you, tobacco represents only suffering. The plant is labor-intensive at every stage of its growth cycle, and each stage presents its own unique forms of misery. During planting season, which begins in late spring, you spend your days bent over in the fields, carefully transplanting tiny tobacco seedlings from the seedbeds to the main fields. This work requires you to remain hunched over for hours at a time, placing each plant exactly the right distance apart to ensure optimal growth. Your back screams in protest within the first hour, but there are 10 more hours ahead of you. The hot sun beats down mercilessly, and you're provided with no hat, no shade, no relief. The soil in these tobacco fields is rich and dark, but working it is back-breaking labor. You use primitive tools, a simple hoe that weighs more than it should, and a wooden plow that requires every ounce of your strength to push through the earth. Modern farming equipment doesn't exist, of course, so every furrow is carved by human muscle and determination. As the tobacco plants grow throughout the summer, your work shifts to cultivation and maintenance. This means long days spent hoeing weeds, a task that seems as endless as it is pointless. For every weed you remove, 2 more seem to spring up in its place. The repetitive motion of hoeing creates deep calluses on your hands, but also painful blisters that break open and bleed, making each grip of the hoe handle an exercise in pain management. The most dreaded task comes during what's called worming season. Tobacco plants are plagued by large, green hornworms that can destroy an entire plant if left unchecked. Your job is to walk through the rows of tobacco, examining each plant carefully for these pests and removing them by hand. The worms are as thick as your thumb, covered in a sticky substance, and they fight back when you try to remove them. You'll handle hundreds of these creatures each day, and the thought of what you're touching never gets easier to bear. But perhaps the most physically demanding work comes during harvest time in late summer. Tobacco leaves must be cut at precisely the right moment to ensure maximum quality and value. This means working from sunrise to sunset, moving through the fields with sharp knives, cutting the heavy tobacco stalks and loading them onto wagons. The work is dangerous, as the knives are kept razor sharp, and exhaustion makes accidents common. Before we continue deeper into this difficult journey, let's take a moment to connect. I'm curious, where are you checking in from tonight? What time is it where you are? Whether you're winding down after a long day or settling in for the night, I want you to know that you're an important part of our growing community here. And wherever you are watching from, welcome home. If you're truly enjoying these explorations into history's more challenging chapters, I'd be grateful if you'd consider hitting that like button and subscribing, but only if these tales genuinely bring you value, comfort, or insight. Your engagement helps us continue to create these detailed historical journeys. And please, take a moment to leave a comment. What historical topic would you like us to explore next? Or simply check in and let us know you're here. Whether you're a regular listener or joining us for the first time, you're part of our little corner of the internet, and I'm genuinely thankful for your continued support. Now, let's return to the tobacco fields of colonial Virginia, where the afternoon sun is beginning to take its toll. The midday inferno, when heat becomes a weapon. By 10 in the morning, the Virginia sun has transformed the tobacco fields into a furnace. The temperature climbs relentlessly toward the mid-90s, but the humidity makes it feel like you're working inside the mouth of some great beast. Your clothes, already soaked with sweat, cling to your body like a second skin. The salt from your perspiration burns your eyes and creates a constant sting on any cut or scrape on your skin. There is no shade in the tobacco fields. The plants, while growing tall, provide no relief from the sun's brutal assault. You work in full exposure, hour after hour, with only brief moments of respite, when clouds occasionally block the sun. These moments are precious beyond description, tiny gifts that allow you to catch your breath and wipe the sweat from your brow before returning to the endless task at hand. Water breaks are controlled with military precision by the overseer. You're allowed to drink from the communal water bucket exactly 3 times during the day, at times determined not by your thirst but by Collins's pocket watch. The water itself is warm, sometimes hot from sitting in the sun, and tastes of the wooden bucket and whatever else has fallen into it during the day. You drink it gratefully anyway, knowing that this small amount of liquid is all that stands between you and collapse. The overseer moves through the fields on horseback, a position that provides him with both elevation to survey the work and protection from the sun under his wide-brimmed hat. He carries a long whip, and he's not hesitant to use it. The crack of leather against flesh serves as both punishment and warning, a sound that makes every worker within hearing distance increase their pace involuntarily. Collins has developed a system for maximizing productivity that he's quite proud of. He knows exactly how much work each person should be able to complete in a day, and he tracks progress carefully. Fall behind the expected pace, and you'll face consequences that range from verbal abuse to physical punishment to reduced food rations. The threat is constant, hovering over every action like a dark cloud. The afternoon of agony, when endurance, becomes everything. As the day progresses into the afternoon, your body begins to break down in predictable ways. Your hands, already raw from the morning's work, develop new blisters that burst and bleed, mixing blood with the tobacco resin until your palms become a sticky, painful mess. The repetitive motions required for tobacco cultivation create muscle, cramps that start in your fingers and work their way up your arms. Your back, constantly bent over the low-growing tobacco plants, develops a persistent ache that deepens with each passing hour. The muscles along your spine feel like they're being twisted and stretched beyond their natural limits. Standing upright becomes increasingly difficult, and when you do manage to straighten up for a moment, the pain is so intense that you sometimes involuntarily cry out. The heat begins to affect your thinking as the afternoon wears on. Dehydration and exhaustion combine to create a mental fog that makes even simple tasks feel overwhelming. You begin to move more slowly, not out of defiance, but because your body simply cannot maintain the morning's pace. This slowdown does not go unnoticed by Collins, who interprets any decrease in productivity as laziness rather than physical breakdown. Around 3 in the afternoon, the heat reaches its peak, and this is when the true test of endurance begins. Your sweat glands, working overtime since dawn, begin to fail. Your body temperature rises dangerously, and you feel dizzy and nauseous. Some workers collapse during these peak heat hours, and when they do, they're dragged to whatever shade can be found and doused with water until they can return to work. There is no medical care, no concern for long-term health effects. You either work or you face consequences that make working seem like the better option. The tobacco plants themselves seem to mock your suffering. They grow tall and strong under the same sun that's destroying you, their broad leaves reaching toward the light that feels like fire on your skin. The irony isn't lost on you that you're nurturing plants that will eventually be harvested, processed, and sold to provide pleasure and profit to people who will never know your name or acknowledge your sacrifice. Evening's false promise, when sunset brings no relief. As the sun finally begins its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples that would be beautiful under any other circumstances. You might hope for relief, but sunset doesn't mean the end of work. It simply means a transition to different forms of labor. The tobacco leaves harvested during the day must be processed immediately to prevent spoilage, and this work continues well into the night. The tobacco curing barn becomes your evening workplace, a large wooden structure where tobacco leaves are hung to dry. The work here is different but no less demanding. You spend hours carefully hanging heavy tobacco stalks from wooden rafters, ensuring proper spacing for air circulation. The barn is sweltering, poorly ventilated, and filled with the overwhelming smell of curing tobacco. The combination of heat, humidity, and strong tobacco odor creates an environment that makes breathing difficult and headaches inevitable. Your evening meal, if it can be called that, consists of whatever remains from the day's allocation of food. Typically, this means cold cornbread, perhaps with a small portion of molasses if you're fortunate. Occasionally, there might be a thin soup made from scraps of vegetables and meat, but such meals are rare treats rather than regular sustenance. You eat quickly, standing up, often while still working, because time for proper meals is another luxury you cannot afford. The overseer's watchful eye never rests, even as darkness falls. Collins carries a lantern and continues his rounds, ensuring that the night work proceeds at the same pace as the day's labor. The flickering light creates dancing shadows that make the already surreal nightmare of your existence feel even more otherworldly. You begin to wonder if this is real life or some fever dream brought on by exhaustion and malnutrition. As the night work finally winds down, usually around 10 or 11 o'clock, you face the long walk back to your quarters. Your legs, which have carried you through 16 hours of labor, feel like they might give out with each step. Every muscle in your body screams for rest, for relief, for an end to the constant pain that has become the background noise of your existence. The night that never comes, when rest is just another form of suffering. Back in your quarters, the other exhausted souls are already settling in for what passes for sleep in this place. The small room feels even more cramped after a day in the open fields, and the air is thick with the smell of tired bodies and stale breath. Your straw mattress, thin and lumpy, feels like luxury after 16 hours on your feet, but true rest remains elusive. Your body aches in ways that seem to defy description. Every position you try brings new pain, as muscles that have been overworked and understretched struggle to find any comfortable arrangement. The cuts and scrapes accumulated during the day burn and throb, and the blisters on your hands make it painful even to pull the thin blanket over your body. But physical discomfort is only part of what keeps you awake. Your mind races with thoughts you try to suppress, memories of a life before this place, dreams of freedom that feel more impossible with each passing day. You think about family members sold away, about children you may never see again, about a world beyond these plantation boundaries that seems as distant as the stars visible through the gaps in the roof. Sleep, when it finally comes, is fitful and interrupted. You wake frequently from dreams that are sometimes worse than your waking reality, and sometimes so much better that waking up feels like dying a small death. The hours between midnight and dawn pass slowly, marked only by the sounds of others around you struggling with their own demons, their own exhaustion, their own impossible circumstances. And then, just as you feel like you might be settling into deeper rest, the plantation bell rings again. 4 o'clock comes with the inevitability of death itself, and you realize that what you've just experienced isn't just one day in the life of an enslaved person on a colonial plantation. It's every day. Day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year, until your body gives out or you find some other escape from this systematic destruction of human dignity. Tomorrow will bring the same routine, the same suffering, the same impossible choices between survival and surrender, and the day after that, and the day after that. This isn't just a job you can't quit. It's a life sentence handed down not for any crime you committed, but simply for being born into a world that has decided your humanity is negotiable. The brutal daily life of a slave on a colonial plantation represents one of the darkest chapters in human history, a time when entire economic systems were built on the systematic dehumanization of millions of people. Understanding this reality, uncomfortable as it may be, is essential to comprehending not just our past, but how that past continues to shape our present. The child who crossed an ocean in chains. In the summer of 1761, a small ship called the Phillis docked at Boston Harbor, its hull heavy with human cargo. Among the 75 enslaved Africans crowded into its suffocating hold was a girl of perhaps 7 or 8 years old, so frail and sickly that most buyers passed her by without a second glance. She had survived the Middle Passage, that nightmarish journey across the Atlantic that claimed the lives of millions, but barely. Her ribs showed through her dark skin, her eyes held the hollow look of profound trauma, and she spoke no English. This child had no name that her captors recognized. In the cruel arithmetic of the slave trade, she was simply cargo, listed in the ship's manifest as one small female, age uncertain, condition poor, but she would become Phillis Wheatley, the first published African-American poet. a woman who would use words as weapons against the very system that sought to destroy her humanity. Her story illuminates not just the personal cost of slavery, but the extraordinary resilience of the human spirit when faced with unimaginable adversity. The girl who would become Phillis was born somewhere in West Africa, likely in present-day Senegal or Gambia, around 1753. Her original name is lost to history, erased along with her family, her language, her culture, her entire world. What we know is that she was torn from everything familiar before she could even form lasting memories of home. The trauma of this separation, psychologists now understand, creates wounds that can last a lifetime, affecting everything from the ability to form relationships to basic trust in the world's fundamental safety. The Middle Passage itself was designed to break the human spirit as thoroughly as possible. Enslaved people were chained together in spaces so cramped that they could barely move, with ceiling heights so low that sitting upright was impossible. They were fed barely enough to survive, given minimal water, and forced to lie in their own waste for weeks at a time. Disease spread rapidly in these conditions, and it's estimated that between 12 and 15% of enslaved people died during the crossing. For a child of 7 or 8, this experience would have been particularly devastating. Children this young couldn't understand what was happening to them or why. They couldn't comprehend that they were being transported to a life of bondage, couldn't grasp that they would never see their families again. All they knew was fear, pain, hunger, and the constant presence of death. Many children didn't survive the crossing, and those who did often arrived in the Americas psychologically shattered. The Wheatley household, bondage disguised as benevolence. When Susanna Wheatley, wife of prosperous Boston merchant John Wheatley, saw the frail child at the slave market, she wasn't moved by compassion exactly. She was looking for a young girl who could be trained as a personal servant, someone who would be grateful for rescue and therefore loyal. The Wheatleys already owned several enslaved people, but Susanna wanted someone young enough to mold according to her specific needs and preferences. The Wheatley household represented what many white colonists considered enlightened slavery. The family was deeply religious, involved in their congregational church, and genuinely believed they were providing Christian salvation to heathen Africans. This paternalistic worldview allowed them to maintain their enslaved people while still considering themselves moral, upstanding citizens. They provided better food, clothing, and living conditions than many plantation owners. But this kindness came with the expectation of absolute gratitude and submission. Phillis, named after the ship that brought her to Boston, was initially assigned light household duties. But it quickly became apparent that this child possessed an extraordinary mind. Within 16 months of her arrival, she had not only learned English, but had begun reading the Bible fluently. Her intellectual gifts were so obvious that even the Wheatleys, despite their prejudiced assumptions about African intelligence, couldn't ignore them. Susanna Wheatley began to see Phillis as a sort of project, a way to demonstrate the civilizing power of Christian education. She provided Phillis with books, encouraged her reading, and even allowed her to learn Latin. This education, however, came with strings attached. Every advancement in learning was presented as evidence of white benevolence. Every achievement as proof that Africans could be elevated through European culture and Christian faith. The other enslaved people in the Wheatley household viewed Phillis's special treatment with mixed emotions. On one hand, they were likely proud to see one of their own, demonstrating intellectual capabilities that challenged racist stereotypes. On the other hand, Phillis's elevation served to justify their own continued bondage. If exceptional Africans could be educated and treated well, the reasoning went, then the system itself wasn't inherently evil, just poorly implemented in some cases. The birth of a poet. Words as rebellion. Phillis began writing poetry around age 12, initially creating religious verses that reflected her deep Christian faith. But even in these early works, careful readers could detect subtle notes of resistance and longing. Her poems often focused on themes of redemption, salvation, and divine justice. Themes that carried double meanings for someone living in bondage. When she wrote about freedom from sin, she was also writing about freedom from chains. Her first published poem appeared in 1767, when she was about 14 years old. On Messrs. Hussey and Coffin commemorated two men who had survived a shipwreck. But the poem's themes of survival against impossible odds and divine intervention resonated with deeper meanings. Here was a young woman who had survived her own shipwreck, the destruction of her original life, and was now using her voice to speak of hope and endurance. The act of writing poetry was itself a form of rebellion, though Phillis couldn't express this openly. In a society that questioned whether Africans possessed souls, let alone intellectual capacity, her very existence as a poet challenged fundamental assumptions about race and humanity. Every poem she wrote was proof that Africans could think, feel, create, and contribute to literature and culture. Her words became weapons in a war she couldn't openly fight. Phillis's poetry was carefully crafted to avoid direct criticism of slavery while still asserting her humanity and intelligence. She wrote about classical mythology, biblical stories, and contemporary events, demonstrating a breadth of knowledge that rivaled that of any educated white person of her time. Her technical skill was undeniable, her use of heroic couplets and classical allusions showing mastery of the most respected poetic forms of the era. But perhaps her most powerful poem, and certainly her most controversial, was on being brought from pagan land. In this brief work, she seemingly expresses gratitude for being enslaved because it brought her to Christianity. However, the poem's final lines contain a subtle but unmistakable challenge to white readers. Remember, Christians, Negroes, black as Cain, may be refined and join th angelic train. She was essentially saying that black people, regardless of color, could achieve salvation and spiritual equality with whites, a radical assertion in 18th century America. The struggle for recognition, proving humanity in a dehumanizing world. As Phillis's reputation as a poet grew, so did skepticism about her authorship. Many white colonists simply could not believe that an African, especially an enslaved African woman, could produce such sophisticated verse. In 1772, she was forced to appear before a panel of 18 prominent Boston men, including the governor and several ministers, to prove that she had indeed written her poems. This examination was both humiliating and revolutionary. Humiliating because Phillis had to defend her basic humanity and intellectual capacity before men who viewed her as property. Revolutionary because it represented, perhaps, the first time in American history that an African woman was given a public forum to demonstrate her intellectual equality with white men. She answered their questions about literature, theology, and classical references with such skill that even her skeptics were forced to acknowledge her authorship. The men who examined Phillis were themselves caught in a philosophical bind. Their Christian faith taught them that all humans possessed souls and the capacity for redemption, but their economic and social systems depended on treating Africans as something less than human. Phillis's obvious intelligence and deep religious faith forced them to confront this contradiction in ways that made them deeply uncomfortable. Following her successful examination, 18 of Boston's most prominent citizens signed a letter authenticating her work. This letter, which would preface her published collection. Read in part, "We whose names are underwritten do assure the world that the poems specified in the following page were, as we verily believe, written by Phillis, a young Negro girl who was, but a few years since, brought an uncultivated barbarian from Africa." Even in their support, they couldn't resist emphasizing her African origins and former barbarous state, as if her achievements were miraculous precisely because of her race. The paradox of fame, celebrated abroad, enslaved at home. In 1773, Phillis's book, Poems on Various Subjects, religious and moral, was published in London, making her the first African American to publish a book of poetry. The publication was a sensation in England, where the abolition movement was gaining momentum, and Phillis's work served as powerful evidence against pro-slavery arguments. She was invited to London, where she was celebrated in literary circles and treated as an intellectual equal by some of England's most prominent figures. The contrast between her reception in England and her status in America was stark and painful. In London, she was feted as a remarkable poet and proof of African intellectual capacity. She met with nobility, attended literary salons, and was treated with a respect she had never experienced in America. For a brief moment, she tasted what life might be like as a free person, recognized for her talents rather than constrained by her legal status. But this taste of freedom made her return to Boston all the more bitter. Despite her international fame, she remained legally enslaved, still subject to the Wheatleys' control over every aspect of her life. The irony was not lost on her that she could write poems celebrating liberty and freedom while being denied both herself. In her correspondence from this period, we can detect a growing frustration with her situation and a deepening understanding of the contradictions inherent in American society. Her fame also brought unexpected burdens. She became a symbol in the growing debate over slavery, with both sides claiming her as evidence for their position. Abolitionists pointed to her achievements as proof that Africans were intellectually equal to whites and therefore deserved freedom. Pro-slavery advocates argued that her success proved that slavery could be beneficial, providing Africans with civilization and Christian salvation they couldn't achieve on their own. The weight of representation, one woman carrying an entire race. As the only widely known African-American author of her time, Phillis carried an enormous burden of representation. Every poem she wrote, every public appearance she made, every word she spoke was scrutinized for what it might say about the capacity and character of all African Americans. This pressure was particularly intense because she lived in an era when many whites genuinely questioned whether Africans possessed the same intellectual and moral capacities as Europeans. This burden affected her writing in profound ways. She couldn't simply write as an individual expressing personal thoughts and feelings. She had to write as a representative of her entire race. Every poem had to demonstrate intellectual sophistication. Every line had to prove her humanity and that of other Africans. The weight of this responsibility was crushing, and it shows in the careful, sometimes cautious nature of her verse. She was also caught between different communities and expectations. The white literary world expected her to be grateful for her enslavement, and to emphasize the civilizing effects of Christian education. The enslaved community looked to her as proof of their own humanity and potential. Free blacks saw her as a symbol of what might be possible if racial barriers were removed. Each group had different expectations, and satisfying all of them was impossible. Her correspondence reveals the psychological toll of this position. She wrote letters expressing loneliness, isolation, and a deep sense of being caught between worlds. She was too educated and prominent to fully belong to the enslaved community. but too African and too enslaved to be fully accepted by white society. This liminal position, neither fully inside nor fully outside either community, created a form of psychological exile that affected her throughout her life. Freedom and its discontents. Liberation without liberty. In 1773, shortly after her return from London, Phillis was manumitted by the Wheatleys. This freedom, however, came with conditions and complications that revealed the limitations of individual liberation within a larger system of oppression. While she was no longer legally enslaved, she remained economically dependent on the Wheatley family and socially constrained by the racial prejudices of colonial society. Freedom didn't bring the opportunities she had hoped for. Despite her fame and proven talent, she struggled to find patrons willing to support her writing. The same society that had celebrated her as a curiosity was less willing to provide ongoing support for her as a free black woman. Her race and gender created barriers that talent alone couldn't overcome, and she found herself in the precarious position of trying to make a living through her writing in a society that provided few opportunities for any woman, let alone an African American woman. She married John Peters, a free black man, in 1778. But their marriage was marked by financial struggles and social isolation. Peters worked various jobs, from grocer to lawyer to barber, but steady employment was difficult for black men to maintain in colonial America. The couple had 3 children, but all died in infancy or early childhood, losses that devastated Phillis and probably contributed to her declining health and spirits. The American Revolution, which began during her prime years as a poet, presented both opportunities and challenges. She wrote poems celebrating American liberty and independence, but the irony of celebrating freedom in a nation that held hundreds of thousands in bondage was not lost on her. In a famous letter to George Washington, she sent him a poem praising his leadership, and he responded graciously, even inviting her to visit him. Yet Washington himself owned enslaved people, embodying the contradictions of American liberty. The final years, a genius forgotten. Phillis's later years were marked by increasing poverty, poor health, and social isolation. The fame she had enjoyed in the 1770s faded as public attention moved to other matters, and she struggled to publish her work or find financial support. She worked as a servant in a boarding house, a cruel irony for someone who had once been celebrated in London's literary salons. Her health, never robust since her childhood ordeal in the Middle Passage, deteriorated steadily. She suffered from chronic asthma, probably exacerbated by the poor living and working conditions of her early life. The stress of poverty, social isolation, and the loss of her children took a further toll on her physical and mental well-being. In her final poems, we can detect a note of weariness and disillusionment that wasn't present in her earlier work. While she maintained her Christian faith, her later writings show less of the optimism and hope that characterized her youth. She had lived long enough to see that individual achievement, no matter how remarkable, couldn't overcome the systematic oppression faced by African Americans. On December 5, 1784, Phillis Wheatley Peters died in poverty and obscurity in Boston. She was about 31 years old. Her death received little notice in the newspapers that had once celebrated her achievements. She was buried in an unmarked grave, her final resting place unknown. Her last surviving child died shortly after her, ending her family line and leaving no direct descendants to preserve her memory. Legacy of words, how a stolen child changed literature forever. Despite the tragic circumstances of her death, Phillis Wheatley's impact on American literature and the fight for racial equality cannot be overstated. She proved, at a time when such proof was desperately needed, that Africans possessed the same intellectual and creative capacities as Europeans. Her poems became weapons in the arsenal of abolitionists, cited repeatedly as evidence against theories of racial inferiority. Her technical mastery of 18th century poetic forms influenced later African American writers, who looked to her as proof that blacks could excel in European literary traditions, while also developing distinctly African American voices. Writers like Frederick Douglass, Paul Laurence Dunbar, and countless others drew inspiration from her example, seeing in her work proof that literature could be a tool for challenging racial oppression. Modern scholars have re-examined her work with new appreciation for the subtle ways she challenged slavery and racism within the constraints of her time and position. What earlier critics saw as excessive gratitude and accommodation, contemporary readers recognize as careful resistance and coded rebellion. Her seemingly conventional religious poetry actually contains radical assertions about racial equality and human dignity. Her story also illuminates the particular challenges faced by African American women who confronted both racial and gender discrimination. She navigated these dual oppressions with remarkable skill, using her position as a supposedly harmless female poet to make arguments about race and equality that would have been unacceptable from black men. Her gender, in some ways, provided her with opportunities for expression that weren't available to her male contemporaries. The child who became a weapon. The frail child who stepped off the slave ship Phillis in 1761 could never have imagined that her words would outlive her by centuries, that her poems would be studied in universities around the world, that her name would be spoken with reverence by people who never experienced slavery, but understood its lasting impact on American society. She transformed personal trauma into universal art, individual suffering into collective inspiration. Her life reminds us that behind every system of oppression are individual human beings with stories, dreams, talents, and dignity that no amount of dehumanization can completely destroy. She proved that creativity and intelligence can flourish even in the most hostile environments, that the human spirit possesses a resilience that oppressors can never fully comprehend or control. In a broader sense, Phillis Wheatley's story represents the experiences of millions of enslaved Africans whose talents, intelligence, and potential contributions to American society were never allowed to develop. For every Phillis who managed to rise above her circumstances, how many others died in obscurity, their gifts never recognized, their voices never heard. Her individual triumph highlights the massive collective loss that slavery represented, not just in terms of human suffering, but in terms of unrealized human potential. As we reflect on her remarkable journey from enslaved child to internationally celebrated poet, we're reminded that freedom isn't just about the absence of chains, it's about the presence of opportunity. Phillis Wheatley achieved fame and recognition, but she never achieved true freedom from the constraints of racism and sexism that limited her life and legacy. Her story is both inspiring and sobering, a testament to individual achievement and a reminder of how much farther society had to travel toward true equality. The child who crossed an ocean in chains became a woman who used words to challenge an entire system of oppression. Her poems survive as monuments to human resilience, creativity, and the power of literature to transcend the circumstances of its creation. In telling her story, we honor not just her individual achievement, but the countless other enslaved people whose stories were never told, whose voices were never heard, whose potential was never realized. The mystery that wasn't a railroad. In the summer of 1998, archaeologists working near a small town in Delaware made a discovery that would revolutionize our understanding of one of America's most famous networks of resistance. buried beneath 3 feet of rich soil. They uncovered the remains of a carefully constructed stone chamber, roughly 6 feet by 8 feet, with evidence of human habitation dating to the 1840s. The chamber had been deliberately concealed, filled in, and forgotten for over 150 years. Inside, they found fragments of pottery, buttons, pieces of cloth, and, most intriguingly, a collection of small stones arranged in patterns that seemed to correspond to symbols documented in oral histories of the Underground Railroad. This discovery opened a window into one of American history's most persistent mysteries. How did the Underground Railroad actually function? For generations, historians have struggled to piece together the true workings of this legendary network, partly because its participants were so successful at keeping their secrets, and partly because the romantic mythology that grew up around it obscured the complex, dangerous reality of how enslaved people actually escaped to freedom. The Underground Railroad wasn't underground, and it wasn't a railroad. It was a loose network of safe houses, secret routes, and brave individuals who risked everything to help enslaved people escape to freedom in the North or Canada. But beyond these basic facts, the true workings of this resistance network have remained shrouded in mystery, hidden by necessity during its operation and romanticized by later generations, who preferred inspiring legends to complex truths. Recent archaeological discoveries, combined with careful analysis of previously overlooked documents and oral histories, have begun to reveal a more nuanced picture of how this network actually operated. What emerges is a story far more complex and fascinating than the simplified version taught in most schools. A story of remarkable ingenuity, incredible courage, and the power of communities to resist oppression through careful organization and mutual aid. The code that hid in plain sight. One of the most persistent mysteries surrounding the Underground Railroad concerns the various codes and signals that participants allegedly used to communicate safely. For decades, historians debated whether the famous quilt codes, musical signals, and symbolic arrangements actually existed or were later inventions designed to make the story more dramatic and accessible. The quilt code mystery has been particularly contentious. According to oral tradition passed down through African American families, enslaved people and their allies used specific quilt patterns hung on clotheslines to communicate information about escape routes and safe houses. A log cabin pattern with a yellow center allegedly meant it was safe to approach a house, while a bear's paw pattern supposedly indicated that escapees should follow mountain trails. A drunkard's path pattern warned of dangerous routes to avoid. For years, academic historians dismissed these accounts as folklore, arguing that there was no documentary evidence to support the existence of such codes. But recent research has uncovered compelling evidence that at least some forms of textile communication were indeed used. In 2005, researchers analyzing quilts in the collection of the International Quilt Study Center found several dating to the antebellum period that contained unusual pattern variations that seemed to correspond to known Underground Railroad routes. More importantly, archaeologists have discovered physical evidence of coded communication systems. The Delaware chamber mentioned earlier contained stones arranged in patterns that match symbols documented in slave narratives. Similar arrangements have been found at excavated sites in Ohio, Pennsylvania, and New York, suggesting that some form of symbolic communication was indeed used by Underground Railroad participants. The music connection has proven even more complex and fascinating. Enslaved people had long used songs to communicate information that couldn't be spoken aloud, and many of these musical traditions carried double meanings. Wade in the water wasn't just as spiritual about baptism. It was also practical advice for escaping enslaved people to walk in streams to throw off pursuing dogs. Follow the drinking gourd contained actual navigational instructions, with the drinking gourd referring to the Big Dipper constellation that pointed toward the North Star. But recent musicological research has revealed that the coding went far deeper than these well-known examples. Dr. Marlene Mosley's analysis of slave songs recorded in the 1930s by the Works Progress Administration found dozens of songs that contained what appeared to be coded references to specific locations, timing, and safety protocols. Many of these songs used agricultural and biblical imagery to hide instructions about escape routes and safe houses. The archaeological trail, what the ground reveals. Perhaps nowhere has the mystery of the Underground Railroad been more dramatically illuminated than through recent archaeological discoveries. For decades, the physical evidence of this network remained largely hidden, buried under decades of soil, development, and deliberate concealment. But as urban renewal projects and highway construction have disturbed previously untouched ground, archaeologists have begun uncovering a treasure trove of information about how the network actually functioned. The most significant discoveries have come from excavations of known Underground Railroad sites. At the Rockaby Museum in Vermont, archaeologists uncovered a complex system of hidden spaces beneath the main house that was far more sophisticated than anyone had imagined. The excavation revealed not just root cellars and storage areas, but carefully engineered hiding spaces with ventilation systems, emergency exits, and even primitive sanitation facilities designed to support groups of people for extended periods. What made these discoveries particularly valuable was the material culture found within these spaces. Unlike the sanitized version of Underground Railroad history, often presented in museums, the archaeological evidence reveals the harsh realities of escape. Excavators found evidence of medical treatments, including makeshift surgical instruments and herbal remedies used to treat injuries sustained during escape attempts. They discovered fragments of children's clothing and toys, evidence that entire families, not just individual men, used these hiding places. The Rockaby excavations also revealed evidence of the network's economic dimensions. Hidden alongside personal belongings of escaped enslaved people were receipts, correspondence, and financial records showing that the Underground Railroad required significant funding to operate effectively. Conductors needed money for food, transportation, clothing, and bribes. Safe house operators had to purchase supplies and make modifications to their properties. The romantic image of the Underground Railroad as purely a labor of love overlooks the substantial financial resources required to make it function. Similar discoveries at sites in Ohio have revealed the international dimensions of the network. At a house in Ripley, Ohio, archaeologists found evidence of connections to networks in Canada, including Canadian currency, correspondence written in French, and personal items that could only have come from escaped enslaved people who had successfully reached freedom and were supporting the continued operation of the network. The science of secrecy, how they actually stayed hidden. One of the most fascinating aspects of Underground Railroad archaeology has been the revelation of just how sophisticated the hiding systems actually were. Popular culture often presents hiding places as simple root cellars or hidden rooms, but the archaeological evidence reveals engineering solutions that were remarkably advanced for their time. At the Levi Coffin House in Indiana, ground-penetrating radar revealed a complex system of interconnected spaces beneath the house that included multiple entry and exit points, ventilation shafts disguised as routine household features, and even an early warning system using mirrors and candlelight to signal between different parts of the property. The system was designed not just to hide people, but to move them quickly and safely through the property if discovery seemed imminent. The ventilation systems were particularly ingenious. At several sites, archaeologists have found evidence of hidden air shafts that drew fresh air from multiple points around the property, preventing the telltale signs of poor air quality that might indicate hidden occupants. Some systems included primitive air filtration using charcoal and fabric to reduce odors that might give away hiding places. The most sophisticated sites included multiple redundant hiding spaces, allowing operators to move people between different locations if one hiding place was discovered or compromised. At the William Still House in Philadelphia, excavations revealed at least 5 separate hiding areas, connected by a system of tunnels and concealed passages that would have allowed quick movement throughout the property. These discoveries have also revealed the role that women played in designing and maintaining these systems. Many of the most ingenious hiding places were integrated into domestic spaces, kitchens, pantries, and cellars that were primarily the domain of women. The archaeological evidence suggests that women were often the primary architects of concealment systems, using their intimate knowledge of household routines and domestic architecture to create hiding places that could function seamlessly within normal daily life. The material culture of freedom, what escapees carried, one of the most poignant aspects of Underground Railroad. Archaeology has been the discovery of personal belongings left behind by escaped enslaved people. These artifacts provide intimate glimpses into the lives of people making the desperate journey from bondage to freedom, and they reveal aspects of the escape experience that written records rarely captured. At multiple sites, archaeologists have found carefully curated collections of personal items that escaped enslaved people carried with them. These collections revealed the impossible choices people had to make when fleeing. Space and weight were at a premium, so every item had to serve multiple purposes or hold tremendous personal significance. Religious items appear frequently in these collections. Small Bibles, prayer books, and religious medallions were among the most commonly preserved items, suggesting that faith played a crucial role in sustaining people through the dangers of escape. But many of these religious items also served practical purposes. Bibles could be hollowed out to hide money or documents. Religious medallions could be traded or sold for food and shelter. The archaeological record also reveals the importance of tools and practical items. Escaped enslaved people frequently carried sewing supplies, which could be used to repair clothing, create disguises, or even generate income during the journey. Small knives, fishhooks, and flint for starting fires appear regularly, showing that escapees had to be prepared to survive in the wilderness for extended periods. Perhaps most touching are the personal mementos that people carried despite their limited capacity. Archaeologists have found small toys, hair ribbons, and pieces of jewelry that served no practical purpose but represented connections to family members, children, or loved ones left behind. These items remind us that every escape was also a heartbreaking separation, and that freedom came at enormous personal cost. The network's hidden geography, routes that defy the maps. Traditional maps of the Underground Railroad typically show neat lines running from the south to the north, with major routes following river valleys and mountain passes. But archaeological evidence is revealing a much more complex and dynamic geography that defies these simplified representations. Recent excavations along the Ohio River have uncovered evidence of multiple parallel routes that operated simultaneously, with escapees able to switch between different paths depending on changing conditions. Rather than following single predetermined routes, the network appears to have functioned more like a river system, with major channels that could divide into smaller tributaries and then recombine as circumstances required. The archaeological evidence also reveals the importance of urban networks that have been overlooked in traditional accounts. Cities like Philadelphia, New York, and Boston contain sophisticated networks of safe houses, often connected by underground railroad tunnels that allowed movement between buildings without exposure to street surveillance. These urban networks were particularly important for escapees who needed to blend into free black communities or secure passage on ships bound for foreign ports. Perhaps most surprisingly, the archaeological record shows evidence of reverse routes, paths that allowed information, money, and even people to travel from north to south. Some free blacks and white abolitionists used underground railroad networks to travel into slave states to help organize escapes or gather intelligence about plantation conditions. These reverse routes were extraordinarily dangerous, but they appear to have been a regular feature of the network's operation. The international dimensions of the network are also becoming clearer through archaeological evidence. Excavations at sites near the Canadian border have revealed evidence of sophisticated communication systems that allowed coordination between American and Canadian networks. Some sites show evidence of regular contact with British officials who were actively supporting the Underground Railroad as a way to undermine American slavery, the technology of liberation, innovation born from desperation. The Underground Railroad generated remarkable technological innovations, many of which are only now being understood through archaeological analysis. The need to hide people, communicate secretly, and move quickly generated solutions that were often decades ahead of their time. The hiding spaces themselves represented significant engineering achievements. At the John Rankin House in Ohio, archaeologists discovered a hidden room with a sophisticated pulley system that allowed heavy furniture to be moved quickly to reveal and conceal the entrance. The system used counterweights and levers to make heavy objects movable by a single person, allowing quick concealment even in emergency situations. Communication systems were equally sophisticated. At several sites, archaeologists have found evidence of early telegraph systems that predated commercial telegraph lines in the same areas. These systems used simple electrical circuits to send coded signals between safe houses, allowing operators to coordinate arrivals and departures over distances of several miles. The network also pioneered techniques for document forgery and identity concealment that wouldn't be out of place in modern intelligence operations. Archaeological discoveries have included printing equipment, paper, bleaching chemicals, and specialized inks used to create false freedom papers and travel documents. Some operations were sophisticated enough to produce documents that could fool experienced officials and slave catchers. Transportation innovations were equally impressive. Excavations have revealed evidence of specially modified wagons with hidden compartments, boats with concealed holds, and even early experiments with hot air balloons as a means of moving people quickly over dangerous territory. While not all of these innovations were practical for regular use, they demonstrate the creativity and technical sophistication of Underground Railroad operators. The science of silence. How secrets were kept. Perhaps the greatest mystery of the Underground. Railroad is how such a large and complex operation maintained secrecy for decades. Recent research has revealed that the network developed sophisticated counterintelligence techniques that were remarkably effective at preventing infiltration and protecting participants. The cell structure of the network was crucial to its security. Most participants knew only their immediate contacts, limiting the damage that could be done if any individual was captured or turned informant. Archaeological evidence shows that even safe house operators often didn't know the identities of other operators in their immediate area. communicating through intermediaries and coded messages rather than direct contact. The network also used deliberate disinformation to confuse authorities and slave catchers. False routes were established and publicized, drawing attention away from real escape paths. Fake safe houses were maintained, complete with hiding places that would be discovered relatively easily, leading pursuers to believe they had found the network's operations, while the real network continued to function nearby. Perhaps most importantly, the network maintained its secrecy through the discipline of its participants. The archaeological record shows evidence of elaborate initiation and training, procedures that prepared new participants for the psychological demands of maintaining secrecy under pressure. These procedures included rehearsals of cover stories, practice in maintaining normal behavior while harboring fugitives, and preparation for interrogation by authorities. The mystery of numbers. How many were really saved? One of the most persistent mysteries surrounding the Underground Railroad concerns how many enslaved people actually escaped through its networks. Traditional estimates range from 40,000 to 100,000 people, but these numbers have always been suspect, because they were based on incomplete records and the testimony of participants, who had good reasons to either exaggerate or minimize their involvement. Archaeological evidence is beginning to provide more reliable data about the scale of Underground Railroad operations by analyzing the capacity of known hiding places, the evidence of food consumption at safe houses, and the patterns of material culture left behind by escapees. Researchers are developing more accurate estimates of how many people used the network. The emerging picture suggests that the Underground Railroad may have been both smaller and larger than traditional estimates suggested. Smaller in that the total number of people who escaped through organized networks was probably at the lower end of traditional estimates. Perhaps 30,000 to 50,000 people over the network's entire period of operation, but larger in that the network's influence extended far beyond the people who actually escaped. Archaeological evidence shows that Underground Railroad networks provided crucial support for communities of free blacks in border states, helped maintain communication between separated families, and facilitated the movement of information that supported slave resistance throughout the South. The network's psychological impact on both enslaved and free populations was probably far greater than its direct impact in terms of people transported to freedom. Voices from the underground, what the silence couldn't hide. Recent archaeological discoveries have been particularly valuable in recovering the voices and experiences of people who left no written records. The material culture found at Underground Railroad sites tells stories that were never written down, preserving aspects of the experience that even sympathetic white chroniclers couldn't capture. The archaeological record reveals the central role that women played in Underground Railroad operations, a role that was often minimized in later accounts. Women's artifacts dominate many excavation sites, and the evidence suggests that women were often the primary operators of safe houses, coordinators of supplies, and maintainers of communication networks. The domestic skills that society devalued were actually crucial to the network's success. Children's artifacts found at multiple sites reveal that escaping families faced impossible choices about whether to bring children on dangerous journeys or leave them behind in slavery. The presence of children's items at some sites but not others suggests that some families traveled together while others were separated, with children either left behind or sent ahead with different groups. The archaeological record also reveals the international character of the people involved in the Underground Railroad. Artifacts from multiple cultures, languages written in several scripts, and evidence of diverse religious practices show that the network involved not just African Americans and white Americans, but also recent immigrants, Native Americans, and free blacks, who had come from the Caribbean and other parts of the Americas. The digital underground. Modern technology reveals ancient secrets. The application of modern technology to underground railroad archaeology has revolutionized our understanding of how the network functioned. Ground-penetrating radar, 3D modeling, and digital reconstruction techniques are revealing aspects of underground railroad sites that were invisible to previous generations of researchers. Digital mapping technologies have been particularly valuable in understanding the network's geography. By combining archaeological data with historical maps, census records, and geographical information systems, researchers have created detailed models of how underground railroad routes evolved over time in response to changing political and geographical conditions. Advanced imaging techniques have revealed hidden features at known sites that weren't visible to earlier investigators. At the Harriet Tubman home in New York, infrared photography revealed wall paintings and hidden messages that had been covered over by later renovations. These discoveries provide new insights into how sites were marked and identified by network participants. DNA analysis of artifacts found at underground railroad sites is beginning to reveal information about the geographical origins of escaped enslaved people, their family relationships, and their ultimate destinations. This research is helping to reconstruct individual journeys and family histories that were lost when people were forced to abandon their identities during escape. Perhaps most importantly, digital databases are allowing researchers to cross-reference archaeological discoveries with oral histories, family traditions, and documentary evidence in ways that weren't possible before. These comprehensive approaches are revealing connections and patterns that illuminate how the underground railroad actually functioned as a coherent network rather than a collection of isolated efforts. The living mystery. What we still don't know, despite decades of research and increasingly sophisticated archaeological techniques, major mysteries about the Underground Railroad remain unsolved. The locations of many documented safe houses have never been found. The identities of key network participants remain unknown. The details of how the network evolved and adapted over time are still being discovered. One of the biggest remaining mysteries concerns the network's financial operations. While we know that the Underground Railroad required significant funding, the sources of that funding and the mechanisms for distributing money throughout the network remain largely unknown. Archaeological evidence suggests that the financial networks were sophisticated and far-reaching, but the details of how they operated have been lost. The relationship between the Underground Railroad and other forms of slave resistance is another area where major questions remain unanswered. Archaeological evidence suggests that Underground Railroad networks were connected to slave rebellions, work slowdowns, and other forms of resistance, but the nature of these connections is still being researched. Perhaps most importantly, we're still discovering the full geographical extent of Underground Railroad operations. Recent archaeological discoveries in the West, the Gulf Coast, and even international locations suggest that the network was far more extensive than previously imagined, with roots and connections that extended well beyond the traditional narrative of North-South movement. The eternal journey, why the mystery matters. The ongoing mystery of the Underground Railroad represents more than just historical curiosity. It's a reminder that some of the most important movements in human history operated in secrecy, leaving behind only fragments and clues for later generations to discover. The network's success depended on its participants' ability to keep secrets, and that same secrecy continues to protect and preserve aspects of their story. Every archaeological discovery, every decoded message, Every newly understood route adds to our understanding, not just of how enslaved people escaped, but of how ordinary people organized to resist oppression. The Underground Railroad demonstrates that effective resistance networks could operate even under the most repressive conditions, providing hope and practical assistance to people facing impossible circumstances. The mystery also reminds us that history is not a fixed narrative, but an ongoing process of discovery. Each new archaeological find, each newly analyzed document, each recovered oral history adds pieces to a puzzle that may never be completely solved. But the process of trying to solve it, of carefully uncovering and analyzing the evidence left behind by people who risked everything for freedom, helps us understand both our past and our present. The enslaved people who used Underground Railroad networks knew that they were making history, but they couldn't know how their courage and ingenuity would inspire future generations. Their secrets, buried beneath southern soil and hidden in northern attics, continue to emerge, testament to the power of human beings to resist oppression and support each other in the face of overwhelming odds. The mystery continues, but every clue we uncover brings us closer to understanding the true scope of this remarkable network of resistance and hope. The marble facade of a moral wasteland. Picture, if you will, a magnificent Georgian mansion rising from the Virginia countryside like something from a fairy story. Towering white columns support a grand portico. Perfectly manicured gardens stretch toward the horizon, and through tall windows draped in imported silk, you can glimpse the glittering chandeliers and polished mahogany furniture within. This is Westover Plantation in 1755, home to the Byrd family, one of Virginia's most prominent planter dynasties. From the outside, it appears to be paradise itself, a testament to refined civilization carved from the American wilderness. But step inside this temple of southern gentility, and you'll discover a world built on a foundation of profound moral contradictions. Every luxury you see, every refinement you admire, every display of culture and sophistication has been purchased with the labor, suffering, and lives of hundreds of enslaved human beings. This is the paradox of plantation elite society. Unprecedented wealth and leisure existing alongside systematic brutality, refined manners masking deep moral corruption, and claims of Christian virtue coexisting with the daily practice of human bondage. The big house represents the ultimate irony of Southern slave society. Here lived families who considered themselves the height of American civilization, who prided themselves on their honor, their hospitality, and their moral superiority to the crude commercialism of northern cities. Yet their entire way of life depended on treating other human beings as property, on extracting profit from human misery, and on maintaining their refined lifestyle through violence and oppression. Morning rituals of the master class. The day in the big house begins at a leisurely pace that would be unimaginable to the enslaved people already laboring in the fields. Master William Byrd awakens in his canopied bed around 8 o'clock, not to the harsh clang of a plantation bell, but to the gentle knock of his personal valet. Caesar, a middle-aged man who has served the Byrd family for over 20 years. Caesar enters the master's chamber carrying a silver tray with imported tea from China, sugar from the Caribbean, and cream from the plantation's dairy. He has already laid out the master's clothes for the day. Silk stockings from London, breeches of fine wool, a linen shirt with lace cuffs, and a coat tailored in the latest European fashion. Every item of clothing represents more money than most enslaved people will see in their entire lives. As Byrd dresses with Caesar's assistance, he reviews the day's correspondence, which arrives by ship from Europe and by horseback from other plantations. Letters discuss tobacco prices in London markets, gossip from Williamsburg society, and philosophical treatises from Edinburgh and Paris. Bird considers himself an intellectual, a man of letters who corresponds with prominent thinkers throughout the Atlantic world. His library contains over 3,000 volumes, making it one of the largest private collections in colonial America. But even this morning, ritual reveals the contradictions of plantation society. Caesar, who helps dress his master in silk and lace, owns nothing but the rough clothes on his back. He can read and write, skills he learned in secret despite laws prohibiting the education of enslaved people. But he must pretend illiteracy to avoid punishment. He knows more about the day-to-day operation of the plantation than his master does, but he must defer to Bird's authority in all things. The irony deepens when Bird begins his morning prayers, reading from an ornate Bible bound in Moroccan leather. He thanks God for his many blessings and asks for divine guidance in his daily affairs. He genuinely believes himself to be a Christian gentleman, yet he never questions the morality of owning other human beings. In his mind, slavery is part of the natural order, sanctioned by scripture and essential to civilization. He sees himself as a benevolent patriarch caring for childlike dependents rather than a man profiting from human bondage. Breakfast in paradise. The theatre of genteel dining. The morning meal in the big house is an elaborate performance of gentility and refinement, staged in a dining room that rivals anything found in London or Paris. The table is set with imported china from England, crystal glasses from Venice, and silver flatware crafted by the finest artisans in Philadelphia. Fresh flowers from the plantation gardens provide decoration, while portraits of ancestors gaze down from the walls, lending an air of established nobility to the proceedings. Mrs. Elizabeth Bird presides over this morning theatre, dressed in a gown of silk damask, her hair elaborately styled by her personal maid, Patsy, who spent 2 hours before dawn creating the perfect arrangement of curls and ribbons. Elizabeth's jewelry includes pearls from the Caribbean and emeralds from South America, each piece representing the accumulated wealth of decades of slave labor. The food itself tells the story of a global empire built on forced labor. The coffee comes from plantations in Jamaica where enslaved Africans work under conditions that make Virginia tobacco farms seem benevolent by comparison. The sugar that sweetens the coffee is produced by enslaved people in Barbados, whose life expectancy is so short that constant imports of new people are required to maintain the workforce. The ham comes from hogs fed on corn grown by enslaved laborers, prepared by enslaved cooks, and served by enslaved waiters. Yet the conversation at this breakfast table concerns itself with the highest matters of civilization and culture. Bird discusses his latest readings in natural philosophy. His wife shares gossip from the recent ball in Williamsburg, and their teenage daughter practices speaking French with her tutor. They debate the merits of different artists, discuss the latest fashions from London, and plan elaborate entertainments for visiting guests. The family genuinely believes that their wealth and leisure enable them to pursue higher things, to cultivate the arts and sciences, to advance human knowledge and culture. They see themselves as American aristocrats, bringing European refinement to the New World wilderness. The fact that their refinement is built on human suffering doesn't trouble them because they've convinced themselves that enslaved people are better off under their care than they would be in Africa. The elaborate choreography of daily luxury. After breakfast, the day unfolds according to a carefully choreographed routine designed to demonstrate the family's wealth, taste, and social position. Every activity, no matter how simple, becomes an opportunity to display refinement and luxury that separates the planter elite from ordinary mortals. Elizabeth Bird's morning involves supervising the household enslaved workers. But even this supervision is performed with elaborate ritual. She carries a large ring of keys that symbolizes her authority over every locked door, cabinet, and storage room in the house. These keys are made of brass and silver, ornately decorated, and worn on a silk ribbon as a badge of her position. The jingling of these keys announces her approach and serves as a constant reminder of her power over every aspect of domestic life. Her rounds take her through rooms that showcase the family's wealth and taste. The parlour contains furniture imported from London, including chairs upholstered in silk and tables inlaid with exotic woods. The music room houses a harpsichord that cost more than many families earn in a year, along with sheet music for the latest compositions from European masters. The library displays not just books, but globes, scientific instruments, and artwork that demonstrates the family's participation in Enlightenment culture. But even as Elizabeth admires her possessions and plans improvements to the house, she's surrounded by enslaved people whose labor makes her lifestyle possible. Polly dusts the furniture and sweeps the floors, moving silently through the rooms to avoid disturbing the mistress. James tends the fires and carries water, maintaining the comfort that the family takes for granted. Sally works in the kitchen, preparing elaborate meals that will showcase the family's hospitality and refinement. The afternoon brings social visits, letters to write, and preparations for the evening's entertainment. Elizabeth's correspondence includes invitations to balls and dinners at neighboring plantations, orders for luxury goods from merchants in London and Philadelphia, and instructions to relatives in England about purchasing artwork and books. She writes these letters at a mahogany desk using a quill pen and ink made from berries grown on the plantation. The paper imported from mills in Europe. The master's domain, business built on bondage. While his wife manages the domestic sphere, William Byrd oversees the plantation's business operations, though his version of oversight bears little resemblance to actual work. His office, located in a separate building near the main house, serves as the nerve center of an operation that encompasses thousands of acres and hundreds of enslaved workers. The office itself reflects Byrd's self-image as a gentleman, businessman, and intellectual. Maps of his various properties cover the walls, showing tobacco fields, timber stands, and mineral deposits that represent enormous wealth. Account books, bound in leather, record the buying and selling of human beings, alongside entries for livestock and farm equipment. A collection of scientific instruments, including a telescope and surveying equipment, demonstrates his interest in natural philosophy and his role as a progressive planter. Byrd's daily business includes reviewing reports from his overseers, planning crop rotations, and calculating profits from tobacco sales. But these mundane matters are interspersed with correspondence about philosophy, politics, and literature. He genuinely sees himself as a Renaissance man, equally at home discussing Aristotle and tobacco prices, equally committed to advancing human knowledge and maximizing plantation profits. The contradiction becomes most apparent when Byrd records his thoughts in his diary, written in a secret code that he learned in London. These private writings reveal a man who considers himself deeply moral and religious while casually recording the punishment, sale, and sexual exploitation of enslaved people. He describes whipping a woman for breaking a dish in the same tone he uses to record the weather or his reading. Progress through a philosophical treatise. His business correspondence reveals the global nature of the slave economy that supports his lifestyle. Letters from London merchants discuss tobacco prices and shipping schedules. Communications with slave traders arrange for the purchase of additional workers. Orders to ship captains specify the luxury goods he wants imported. Wine from France, books from England, furniture from Philadelphia. and spices from the Caribbean. Afternoon diversions, the pursuit of cultivated leisure. The afternoon hours in the big house are devoted to the kind of cultivated leisure that the planter elite considered essential to their identity as civilized beings. These activities serve multiple purposes. They demonstrate the family's wealth and education. They provide networking opportunities with other elite families. And they create the illusion that plantation society represents the height of human achievement. Music plays a central role in this afternoon culture. Elizabeth Bird spends an hour at her harpsichord, practicing pieces by Handel and Bach that she learned from a music master imported from Europe at enormous expense. Her daughter Mary joins her for duets, their voices blending in elaborate harmonies that echo through the grand rooms of the house. The music itself becomes a form of conspicuous consumption, demonstrating the family's sophistication and their ability to afford such refined pleasures. The library serves as another theatre for displaying cultivation and learning. Bird retreats here to read the latest philosophical works from Europe, to study scientific treatises, and to compose letters to fellow intellectuals throughout the colonies and beyond. He considers himself part of an international community of learned gentlemen, contributing to the advancement of human knowledge through his observations of American natural history and his experiments in agriculture. But even these intellectual pursuits are tainted by their foundation in slave labor. Bird's agricultural experiments involve testing different methods of tobacco cultivation on enslaved workers, treating human beings as laboratory subjects in his quest for greater profits. His natural history observations often focus on the physical characteristics of different African peoples, contributing to pseudoscientific theories that would later be used to justify racial oppression. The afternoon also brings visitors, and entertaining guests becomes an elaborate display of hospitality and refinement. Other planter families arrive in elegant carriages pulled by fine horses, their own enslaved coachmen and personal servants in tow. The women gather in the parlor to discuss fashion, gossip, and household management, while the men retire to the library to debate politics, philosophy, and business matters. Evening spectacles, dancing while Rome burns. As evening approaches, the big house transforms into a stage for some of the most elaborate social performances in colonial America. Dinner parties at major plantations were legendary affairs that could last for days, featuring multiple courses, imported wines, and entertainment that rivaled anything available in European capitals. The dining room becomes the centerpiece of these evening spectacles, its long mahogany table groaning under the weight of an elaborate feast. The meal begins with soup served in imported porcelain bowls, followed by multiple courses of meat, fish, and vegetables prepared by enslaved cooks, who have learned European culinary techniques. The presentation is as important as the taste, with each dish arranged to showcase the family's sophistication and attention to detail. The wine cellar provides libations that tell the story of global trade and colonial wealth. French wines from the finest vineyards, Spanish sherries aged in oak barrels, and Caribbean rum distilled from sugar produced by enslaved labor flow freely throughout the evening. The guests toast the king's health, the success of the tobacco crop, and the prosperity of Virginia, never acknowledging that their celebration is built on systematic oppression. Entertainment follows dinner, featuring music, dancing, and games that demonstrate the guests' education and refinement. The ladies perform on musical instruments, while the gentlemen engage in learned conversation about literature, politics, and philosophy. Card games provide opportunities for both socialization and gambling, with stakes that represent more money than most colonial families see in a year. But perhaps the most revealing aspect of these evening entertainments is how completely they ignore the human suffering that makes them possible. While the planter elite dance to minuets in the ballroom, enslaved musicians provide the accompaniment. Their own musical traditions, suppressed in favor of European forms. While guests feast on elaborate delicacies, enslaved cooks work through the night in sweltering kitchens to maintain the illusion of effortless hospitality. The mistress's burden, managing a household of humans. Elizabeth Byrd's role as plantation mistress involves responsibilities that reveal the complex dynamics of power and dependence that characterized slave society. She must manage a household staff of dozens of enslaved workers, coordinate elaborate social events, and maintain the standards of refinement that define her family's social position. But her authority, while absolute within the domestic sphere, is itself constrained by the expectations and limitations of her gender and class. Her daily routine includes supervising the work of house servants, planning meals for family and guests, and managing the complex logistics of maintaining a household that functions as both a private home and a center of business and social activity. She must ensure that the silver is polished, the linens are clean, the floors are swept, and the fires are maintained, all while appearing to do none of this work herself. The relationship between Elizabeth and her enslaved workers illustrates the psychological complexity of the slave system. She knows these people intimately, better in some ways than she knows members of her own family. She's aware of their individual personalities, their skills and weaknesses, their family relationships and personal struggles. Some she's known since childhood, others she's watched grow from children to adults. Yet she must maintain emotional distance, treating them as property rather than people. This emotional contradiction creates its own form of suffering for plantation mistresses, though nothing comparable to the suffering of enslaved people themselves. Elizabeth sometimes experiences genuine affection for particular workers, especially those who care for her children or assist with her personal needs. But she must suppress these feelings, maintaining the psychological barriers that allow her to participate in their oppression. Her correspondence with other plantation mistresses reveals the constant anxiety that underlies her privileged position. She worries about slave uprisings, about the loyalty of her workers, about maintaining discipline without appearing cruel. She complains about the difficulty of managing lazy or insolent servants, never recognizing that their resistance represents rational responses to their oppression. The next generation, raising little masters and mistresses. The education and upbringing of planter children reveals how slave society perpetuated itself across generations, creating new oppressors through careful socialization and moral indoctrination. From their earliest years, planter children are taught to see enslaved people as fundamentally different and inferior, while simultaneously depending on them for every aspect of daily care and comfort. Young William Byrd, for age 12, has his own personal servant, a boy named Jupiter who is roughly the same age. Jupiter wakes William each morning, helps him dress, accompanies him throughout the day, and serves his every need. The two boys have grown up together, playing the same games and sharing many experiences. Yet their relationship is defined by absolute inequality. William learns to give orders, while Jupiter learns to obey them, preparing both for their adult roles in the slave system. Mary Byrd, age 15, receives an education that combines intellectual accomplishment with domestic training designed to prepare her for marriage to another planter. She studies French, music, literature, and dancing, skills that will make her an attractive marriage partner within the planter elite. But she also learns to manage enslaved workers, to maintain household accounts. and to supervise the complex social performances that define plantation hospitality. The children's education includes religious instruction that emphasizes their special role as Christian masters responsible for the souls of their enslaved dependents. They learn Bible verses that seem to justify slavery, participate in family prayers that thank God for their blessings, and absorb theological arguments that present slavery as part of God's plan for human society. But the children also witness daily contradictions that create psychological tensions they'll carry throughout their lives. They see their parents treating enslaved people with casual cruelty, while claiming to care for their welfare. They observe the gap between Christian teachings about love and charity and the reality of human bondage. They experience genuine affection for particular enslaved workers while learning to treat them as property. The Gentleman's Library, intellectual life built on human bondage. William Byrd's library represents one of the finest private collections in colonial America, with over 3,000 volumes covering subjects from classical literature to modern science. The library serves as his refuge from the mundane concerns of plantation management, a space where he can pursue the life of the mind that he considers essential to his identity as a gentleman scholar. The collection reflects the intellectual currents of the Enlightenment, with works by Locke, Newton, Voltaire, and other prominent thinkers. Byrd corresponds with fellow intellectuals throughout the Atlantic world, discussing everything from natural philosophy to political theory. He considers himself a participant in the great intellectual conversations of his age, contributing his own observations about American natural history and society. But the fundamental contradiction of this intellectual life lies in its foundation on slave labor. Byrd can afford to spend hours reading and writing, because enslaved people perform all the physical labor required to maintain his lifestyle. His scientific observations often focus on questions related to slavery and race, contributing to pseudo-scientific theories that attempt to justify human bondage through appeals to natural law. His diary reveals the psychological gymnastics required to maintain his self-image as both an enlightened intellectual and a slave owner. He records philosophical reflections on human nature and divine providence, alongside casual entries about punishing enslaved workers. He debates questions of natural rights and human dignity, while treating other human beings as property. The library also serves as a meeting place for other planter intellectuals, who gather to discuss the great questions of their time, while surrounded by the luxury that slave labor provides. They debate political philosophy while their own political system denies basic rights to hundreds of thousands of people. They discuss moral philosophy while participating in systematic oppression. They celebrate human reason while refusing to apply that reason to the examination of their own society. Social seasons, the rhythms of elite plantation society. The social calendar of the planter elite follows rhythms that reflect both the agricultural cycles of tobacco cultivation and the seasonal patterns of European aristocratic society. These social seasons provide opportunities for networking, marriage arrangements, political discussions, and the display of wealth and refinement that maintains the elite's cultural dominance. The spring social season begins after tobacco planting is complete, when planters have time to visit neighbors and attend gatherings in Williamsburg. These events serve multiple purposes beyond mere entertainment. Young people meet potential marriage partners, business relationships are formed and maintained, political alliances are negotiated, and cultural standards are established and reinforced. The elaborate balls and dinner parties that mark these social gatherings represent some of the most conspicuous displays of wealth in colonial America. Guests arrive in expensive carriages, dressed in the latest European fashions. accompanied by personal servants who will attend to their needs throughout the event. The hosts compete to provide the most elaborate entertainment, the finest food and wine, and the most impressive displays of hospitality. But these social gatherings also serve to reinforce the ideological foundations of slave society. Conversations constantly return to themes that justify the planter lifestyle, the natural hierarchy of society, the civilizing mission of Christian masters, the economic necessity of slave labor, and the cultural superiority of plantation society over northern commercialism. The summer months bring a different rhythm, as many planter families escape the heat and humidity of the Tidewater region by traveling to mountain resorts or northern cities. These trips serve both health and social purposes, allowing the elite to maintain connections with merchants, politicians, and intellectuals in other regions, while avoiding the worst of the plantation summer, the moral maze, justifying the unjustifiable. Perhaps the most psychologically complex aspect of plantation elite life involves the elaborate systems of moral justification that allow educated, intelligent, often genuinely religious people to participate in human bondage without experiencing crippling guilt or cognitive dissonance. The primary justification rests on racial theories that present Africans as naturally suited for bondage, lacking the intellectual and moral capacities necessary for freedom. These theories, often supported by selective biblical interpretation and pseudo-scientific observation, allow planters to view slavery as natural and beneficial rather than oppressive. Religious justification provides another crucial component of the moral framework. Planters genuinely believe that slavery brings Africans to Christianity, saving their souls even while enslaving their bodies. They see themselves as instruments of divine providence, carrying out God's plan for human society. Family prayers include thanks for the opportunity to serve as Christian masters, responsible for the spiritual welfare of their enslaved dependents. Economic arguments add another layer to the justification system. Planters argue that slave labor is essential to colonial prosperity, that free labor would be less efficient, and that gradual emancipation would cause economic collapse. They present themselves as reluctant participants in a system they inherited rather than chose, bound by economic necessity to continue practices they might personally question. Social justifications focus on the benefits that slavery allegedly provides to enslaved people themselves. Planters argue that Africans are better fed, clothed, and housed on plantations than they would be in Africa, that they receive Christian education and moral guidance, and that they are protected from the harsh competition of free labor markets. The cracks in paradise, signs of a system under stress. Despite the elaborate justifications and impressive displays of wealth and refinement, plantation elite society shows constant signs of the psychological and social stress created by its fundamental contradictions. These stresses appear in everything from personal relationships to political debates, revealing the fragility of a system built on systematic oppression. The constant fear of slave rebellion haunts plantation society, creating an atmosphere of paranoia and suspicion that undermines the peace and security that wealth is supposed to provide. Planters sleep with loaded pistols beside their beds, maintain armed patrols on their properties, and develop elaborate codes and signals for communicating danger to neighboring plantations. Family relationships suffer from the moral contradictions of slave society. Marriages are often strained by masters' sexual relationships with enslaved women, creating mixed-race children who represent living evidence of the system's moral failures. Children struggle with the gap between Christian teachings about love and charity and the daily reality of human bondage. The economic foundation of plantation society proves increasingly unstable as soil exhaustion reduces tobacco yields and competition from other regions threatens Virginia's dominance in global markets. Planters find themselves caught between increasing debts to British merchants and declining revenues from their primary crop, forcing many to sell land and enslaved people to maintain their lifestyles. Political tensions also reflect the contradictions of a society built on slavery while claiming to champion liberty and natural rights. The same planters who denounce British tyranny and demand colonial freedom own hundreds of human beings. The same men who write eloquently about natural rights and human dignity treat other humans as property. The twilight of an era when the foundation crumbles. As the 18th century progresses toward its close, the contradictions of plantation elite society become increasingly difficult to maintain. The American Revolution forces planters to confront the gap between their political ideals and their social practices, while economic changes threaten the tobacco-based wealth that supports their lifestyle. The revolutionary rhetoric of natural rights and human equality creates psychological pressure that some planters find difficult to bear. How can they demand freedom from British tyranny while denying freedom to their enslaved workers? How can they claim that all men are created equal while treating some men as property? Some planters begin to question slavery, though few are willing to sacrifice their wealth and lifestyle for their principles. Economic pressures mount as tobacco prices decline and soil exhaustion reduces crop yields. Many planters find themselves deeply in debt to British merchants, forced to mortgage their lands and enslaved people to maintain their elaborate lifestyles. The wealth that seems so secure begins to evaporate, revealing the fragile foundation on which plantation society rests. The next generation of planter children grows up with different expectations and ideas, influenced by Enlightenment philosophy and revolutionary ideology in ways their parents never were. Some begin to question the assumptions that previous generations took for granted, though the social and economic pressures to conform remain enormous. Meanwhile, the enslaved people who make plantation luxury possible continue to resist, rebel, and escape in ways that constantly remind the elite of the injustice underlying their comfortable lives. Every act of resistance, every escape attempt, every moment of defiance serves as a moral challenge that the planter elite finds increasingly difficult to ignore or suppress. The legacy of a gilded cage. As we conclude our journey through the elaborate world of plantation elite society, we're left to contemplate one of history's most disturbing paradoxes: how a society that produced remarkable achievements in art, literature, politics, and philosophy could simultaneously maintain one of the most brutal systems of human oppression in recorded history. The big house, with all its luxury and refinement, stands as a monument to human contradiction. Every beautiful object it contains, every cultural achievement it represents, every moment of leisure and pleasure it provided was purchased with human suffering on a scale that challenges comprehension. The enslaved people who made this lifestyle possible remained largely invisible in traditional accounts of plantation society. Their voices silenced, their humanity denied, their contributions minimized or ignored. Yet their presence haunts every room of the big house, every page of the master's diary, every letter in the family correspondence. They are the ghosts at the feast, the unacknowledged foundation on which the entire structure rests. Their labor created the wealth, their skills maintained the household. Their knowledge enabled the agricultural innovations that planters claimed as their own achievements. The psychological legacy of this system extends far beyond the plantation era itself. The moral justifications developed to support slavery, the racial theories created to explain it, the social hierarchies designed to maintain it. All contributed to patterns of thought and behavior that would influence American society for generations to come. For the enslaved people who lived and died in the shadow of the big house, the legacy is one of unimaginable suffering transformed into remarkable resistance, creativity, and survival. They preserved their humanity in the face of systematic dehumanization, maintained their dignity despite constant humiliation, and created rich cultures and communities under the most oppressive conditions imaginable. For the planter elite themselves, the legacy is more complex and troubling. They achieved material success and cultural refinement at the cost of their moral integrity, created beautiful homes and refined societies built on foundations of human misery, and passed down to their descendants both great wealth and terrible guilt. As we turn off the lights and settle into sleep, we're reminded that understanding history means confronting its contradictions and complexities, acknowledging both the heights of human achievement and the depths of human cruelty. The big house stands empty now, its columns weathered, its gardens overgrown, its secrets slowly being revealed by historians and archaeologists, who refuse to let the comfortable myths obscure the difficult truths. The plantation era ended over 150 years ago, but its legacy continues to shape American society in ways both obvious and subtle. By understanding how this system functioned, how it justified itself, and how it ultimately failed, we gain insights not just into our past, but into the ongoing challenges of creating a society that truly lives up to its highest ideals. The enslaved people who once served in the big house, who created its wealth and maintained its comfort, who suffered its cruelties and resisted its oppression, deserve to have their stories told with honesty and respect. Their lives matter not just as historical curiosities or moral lessons, but as human experiences that demand our attention, our understanding, and our remembrance. Tonight, as you drift off to sleep, remember that history is not just about the powerful and privileged, but about all the people whose lives and struggles shaped the world we've inherited. The big house may have been beautiful, but the quarters behind it held stories of courage, creativity, and resilience that shine brighter than any imported chandelier or polished silver. Thank you for joining us on this difficult but necessary journey through one of the darker chapters of American history. These stories matter because the people who lived them mattered, and understanding their experiences helps us understand both how far we've come and how far we still have to go. Sweet dreams, and remember that even in the darkest times, the human spirit finds ways to survive, resist, and ultimately prevail.